trembled because a pen touched paper behind closed doors. Single silent moment. The rain.
King Edmund of Aldervane spent the morning in the small map room off the west corridor, the one place in the palace where the walls still smelled faintly of old paper and older decisions. When the door opened without a knock, he already knew who it would be. His private secretary entered carrying a single folder, and the way the man held it, both hands, elbows tucked, eyes down, told the king that the waiting was over. The papers inside were plain. 3 pages, a ribbon, a space for a signature. They were the formal instrument by which a monarch begins the process of stepping away from the throne, and for 11 months they had sat in a locked drawer while Edmund told himself he was not yet ready.
Today he did not tell himself that.
He read the first page twice, picked up the pen his father had once used to sign a treaty nobody remembered anymore, and wrote his name beneath the words. The time has come. He did not feel triumphant. He felt like a man setting down something heavy he had carried so long that his arms had forgotten what it was to be empty. Before we go further into what this means for the royal household of Aldervane, a quick note. This is a work of fiction, not a report about any real monarchy or real family. The secretary lifted the folder the way he might lift something fragile, though the paper weighed nothing at all. Edmund watched it leave the room and understood, in a way he hadn't fully understood until that moment, that a signature is not an ending. It is a door left open, and everyone in the house has to decide whether to walk through it. Queen Consort Adelaide received the news in her sitting room from a lady-in-waiting who delivered it more gently than the words deserved. She read the message twice, as if a second reading might change its meaning. It didn't. Edmund had signed. The place beside him, the place she had spent a decade earning, defending, and quietly fighting for against a public that had never fully forgiven her, was no longer guaranteed by his crown. It would now depend on whatever came next, and on people who had not yet decided what they thought of her. Crown Prince Robert was summoned within the hour. He did not look surprised. He had watched his father grow quieter for months, but he looked wounded, because there is a particular kind of pain in watching a parent's life's work end while you are still learning how to on your own. His first question was not about ceremony or timing. It was simply, where is he now? The question moved through the household like a small alarm, because everyone understood that a signed abdication does not just change ceremony. It changes who people are loyal to and how quickly they have to decide. Princess Helena, the king's sister, took the news the way she took most things, as a fact to be managed rather than an emotion to be felt. She had spent 30 years believing the institution mattered more than any single person's comfort inside it, herself included, and she was not about to change that belief now. Duchess Miriam, Robert's wife, said little and stayed close to her husband instead, understanding that he needed someone nearby who wouldn't ask him to perform grief and duty at the same time. Every family crisis like this one begins with paperwork and ends with people. Edmund had signed as a king, but he now had to explain himself as a father and a husband, and that conversation could not be delegated to any secretary. What the public never learned, because in this story, as in most real ones, the real turning point happened quietly, was that the decision hadn't begun with the signature at all. It began weeks earlier, during a private rehearsal for an investiture, when Edmund paused in the middle of a ceremonial oath and, for 3 full seconds, could not remember the next line. Robert, sitting nearby, rose without thinking and stepped toward him, not to take anything, but to steady him. The room noticed. Edmund noticed the room noticing. A monarchy survives on the appearance of certainty, and in that rehearsal, certainty had visibly slipped, in front of exactly the people trained to protect the illusion that it never does. Edmund asked for the line to be read again. It was, and the room moved on, and nobody spoke of it publicly. But he carried that silence with him for weeks, the specific knowledge that when he faltered, every eye in the room had gone not to him, but to his son. Adelaide noticed something else in that same rehearsal, the way people's expressions softened toward Robert and grew careful around Edmund, the particular shift in a room when it starts quietly picking its next center of gravity. She understood immediately what that meant for her own position, and it frightened her more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. Helena, Ever the pragmatist, later told her brother plainly that hesitation at the top could not be treated as a private matter once the institution itself had felt it. She wasn't being cruel. She was protecting the one thing she'd given her life to, not her brother's pride, but the crown's ability to be trusted. Days after the rehearsal, a transition file appeared on Edmund's desk, a practical document outlining how responsibilities would move from one reign to the next. He didn't ask who had prepared it. He already knew the answer. Everyone had known before he'd said a word. Before the ink was even dry on the signed papers, Adelaide asked for one last conversation, alone, and it became the conversation neither of them would ever fully repeat to anyone else. She asked him, directly, whether he had signed out of duty, or exhaustion, or surrender. He didn't answer quickly because he understood that whichever word he chose would become the story the family told itself for years. He finally said the only thing he was certain was true. The time had come. She heard something final in his voice that frightened her more than anger would have. When she reached for the folder, as if touching it might undo it, he moved it gently out of her reach, not to punish her, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. Robert waited outside that door the entire time, close enough to hear fragments and disciplined enough not to enter, understanding that walking in too soon would make Adelaide feel replaced before anyone had said the truth aloud, even to themselves. What followed inside the palace was not an explosion, but a narrowing. A few offices changed hands. A few names were quietly redirected from the king's household to the crown prince's transition team. Robert entered his first planning meeting without triumph. If anything, the absence of triumph was the most honest thing in the room, understanding that every chair at that table now carried a message he hadn't asked for. Helena warned him, without softness, that mercy for his father could not be allowed to look like confusion about who was now in charge. He didn't answer right away. He knew she wasn't asking him to stop loving his father. She was asking him not to let love become hesitation. The most important conversation, though, happened away from any of it. No aides, no folders, no careful palace language. Just a father and a son, in a room too quiet for history books. Edmund admitted, in a voice no public statement could ever manage, that signing away the throne had felt like losing part of himself and protecting the whole of something larger, both at once. Robert told him he had never wanted the crown to come to him through his father's pain. Edmund closed his eyes at that. He took off his signet ring, held its weight for a moment, and then, instead of handing it over, placed his hand over his son's. It wasn't a transfer of command. It was trust, offered the only way he knew how. By the time the news reached the public, the story had already become something bigger than one family's private reckoning. People gathered outside the palace gates, some leaving flowers as though mourning something that hadn't fully ended yet, others simply standing and rereading the headline, trying to decide whether what they'd witnessed was loss, courage, or both. Robert appeared before the cameras with careful composure, aware that every word he chose would be measured against his father's silence. Miriam stood near enough to study him without pulling focus, understanding that if he looked too eager, people would recoil, and if he looked too broken, they would worry the institution itself was unsteady. Adelaide watched the coverage alone. She saw Robert's name rise and Miriam's calm praised, and she felt, in a way that had nothing to do with logic, the ground shifting away from her. It was a real loss, and no ending to this story would fully undo it. In the end, Edmund didn't tear the folder open again, and he didn't take his signature back. He simply rested his hand on it for one last moment, then walked away without looking behind him. Not a collapse. A handoff, made in grief and love in roughly equal measure. The kind of ending that doesn't feel like triumph for anyone, but that everyone, eventually, learns to live inside.